Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for being so prompt and so on time. I'm Joanna Shelton, and I will be moderating this session, the second of the day. As you can see, the title of this is Climate Change and Technological Winners and Losers. Certainly this question is of great importance in the Asia-Pacific region and indeed throughout the world. How are we going to fare with climate change and in the search for new technologies to address it? We're very fortunate to have two very expert speakers today, Dr. Joshua Meltzer and Mr. Peter Gallagher. We will have Joshua Meltzer begin the session. He is, you have a bio in front of you, but he is a fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. He does a lot of writing and speaking in the area of trade, trade and environment, and teaches as well. Prior to his work at the Australian Embassy in Washington, D.C., he was a trade negotiator, so he's had a perspective that spans a number of different disciplines, and I'm sure we'll bring that to bear in his paper, which is Developing Green Technology and the Impacts on International Trade. Dr. Meltzer.
Good morning, everyone, and certainly thank you to Alliance 21 and the US Study Centre and Andy for the invitation to be here today. I'm going to, in the next 20 minutes, try to address three key issues. Firstly, what I'm going to do is provide a brief overview of United States climate change policy, and then I'm going to discuss briefly the role in that space for a carbon tax, particularly with a view to thinking about the implications of this for innovation and green technology. And then I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about what a carbon tax would mean for international trade. I think when one looks at United States climate change policies, and certainly at the federal level, the key point I probably want to make is that they really need to be understood as being focused on driving innovation and green technology. And I think this sort of compares to the focus of other countries such as Australia, obviously, and the EU on actually pricing carbon, whether through a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. I mean, certainly it's the case that there is probably arguably an implicit carbon price in the United States from some of the policies that I'll talk about briefly, but the implicit carbon price is low, and it's really it's not the main intention of the policies. Now, this move in the United States towards a focus on innovation and into green technologies commenced decisively under the presidency of George W. Bush, probably as early as 2001. There were certainly efforts to pass a federal cap and trade system during the early years of the Obama administration, though this obviously didn't go anywhere, and it appears that there was really never enough support from the White House for this. And certainly since then, under the Obama administration, there's really been a continuation of this emphasis and this focus on policies to drive innovation into green technologies. And the passage in particular in 2009 of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, otherwise known as the stimulus bill, what was in essence a doubling down on this approach. So for instance, we saw spending on green energy as a result of this act doubled from approximately $17 to $18 billion in 2007 to closer to $38 billion in 2010. And some of the policies and some of that have come out of this spending, for instance, have been something called ARPA-E, which is Advanced Research Projects Energy, which has been modelled on a very similar Defence Department policy, which is fundamentally aimed at driving transformative changes in the energy space in the United States. And already approximately $1 billion has been spent here, but there's a range of other key policies in this area. For instance, significant funds have been made available for R&D and innovation in areas such as advanced vehicles, fuels, battery technology, and clean coal. In addition to this suite of policies, there's been significant action by the Environment Protection Agency, exercising its regulatory powers under the Clean Air Act. A couple that I will mention and I think are relevant in thinking about in terms of its impact on innovation in the United States are the increase in fuel efficiency standards, which by 2025 are quite significant, and this should certainly drive innovation in the auto industry towards achieving these goals. The EPA is also now requiring large emitters of CO2 to develop what's called best available control technology, and this essentially is going to also move industry to innovating and using increased energy efficiency technologies. I think an interesting question that comes from this is what is driving this focus in the United States of its climate change policies, and I think it's interesting to think about this both from a political and from an economic perspective. From a political perspective, the focus on innovation really plays to a deep-seated US sense of its capacity in developing and commercialising new technologies. I mean, certainly I think it's arguable that if the United States is successful in this space, it could likely be the most significant contribution the US will make to addressing climate change. It also resonates in the United States with past large-scale scientific and government-led endeavours, and one thinks of, for instance, the Manhattan Project, which obviously led to the development of the nuclear bomb, and the Apollo project. And in fact, you hear in the political debate in the United States references to the need for a Manhattan Project or an Apollo project with respect to addressing climate change. The focus on innovation, I think, also plays an important role in addressing scepticism which still very much exists in Congress on the causes of climate change. And it allows for the administration to move the focus away from the price of carbon and what the costs are to the US economy, and to refocus the debate on innovation and technology and jobs and the like. And certainly since the 2008 financial crisis, the Obama administration has made the development of green technologies a key part of a broader strategy in the United States for developing new drivers of economic growth and jobs. From an economic perspective, the rationale for essentially US government policy to stimulate innovation in these areas comes from the classic market failure that drives a lack of private investment in R&D generally, and leads to socially suboptimal outcomes. I mean, one of these is the positive externalities that come from R&D, where essentially private firms are unable to capture the full benefits from R&D, and a lot of the positive knowledge spillovers to society generally, which also increase as the use of this knowledge increases, means that there's a role in this space for government policy to stimulate greater levels of R&D. Another reason for US government policy generally in this space, particularly when you think about the energy space, is the potential lock-in of suboptimal technologies. And this is particularly problematic when one thinks about the drivers of energy in the United States, particularly the reliance of coal, where the significant investment in coal-fired utilities means that there's a fairly large incentive for operators to incrementally adjust their operations rather than doing large-scale shifts to lower carbon technologies such as renewable energy. So given this suite of policies, the question I ask is, what role is there here for a carbon tax, particularly when we think about innovation and green technologies being a primary aim? Now, the reason I talk about a carbon tax, I should say at the beginning, is because it's clear that there's no prospect, at least in the short to medium term, for a federal cap and trade system. And there is some discussion in Washington at the moment of a carbon tax as part of a larger tax deal. And so I think it's probably, out of the option for pricing carbon, the most feasible one at the moment. Certainly from an economic perspective, we know that a carbon tax that would be levied on CO2 emissions at a rate that equates marginal costs to the social cost of society of CO2 would be a very efficient outcome and produce significant welfare gains. It would produce the correct carbon price, reduce consumption of energy-intensive goods, and the like. There would also be a secondary effect, which is, I think, also important here, which would be the role that a carbon tax would have on firms to actually innovate as well. as a means of reducing their CO2 emissions. This is often referred to as induced innovation, and obviously arises from where a carbon price which would change relative factors of production and create an incentive to minimise use of the relatively more expensive factor, in this case being those that produce CO2. So in this sense, a carbon tax in the United States would very much be a double dividend, in the sense that it would internalise the environmental cost of CO2, and it would also complement US policies which are aimed at inducing and encouraging innovation into green technologies. But a carbon tax alone obviously is not going to achieve this. There's a range of reasons for this. One is that it's possible that while there's going to be an incentive for innovation, that a carbon tax, the cost of that to a firm may actually outweigh the benefits from developing green technologies. There's also evidence when one looks at the OECD, where there are a range of environmental taxes, that this can actually encourage firms to move incrementally in the direction of innovation, and usually into sort of small steps, but it's not going to lead to the type of transformative outcomes that you might need, particularly in the climate change and energy space. And as a result, some of the market failures also that I just talked about previously, particularly when one thinks about technological lock-in, the type of carbon tax that you might need to overcome that is possibly going to be too high to be politically feasible, at least in the short term. So what this suggests is that an optimal policy mix in the United States, when one thinks about an aim on innovation and green technologies, is the current suite of policies aimed at encouraging that, plus a carbon tax. In this next bit, I just want to talk now about what the implications are going to be for international trade, and also focusing on the Asia-Pacific region in the event that the United States does go down the path of adopting a carbon tax. So I want to focus on three key areas to think about. The first is what would be the implication of a United States carbon tax for innovation in the Asia-Pacific region. And when one thinks through this, it's clear that what will happen is that a carbon tax will certainly significantly increase demand in the United States for technologies to reduce CO2 emissions. And this increase in demand by the world's largest economy for green technologies is going to be a key driver for the development of new green technologies globally. And so this should lead to greater levels of innovation and R&D. It will create opportunities for scientific collaboration and developing skills and knowledge to commercialise new green technologies. And there's an important role for government here in this space. And some of the policies which could flow from this, for instance, would be support of joint initiatives with other countries, whether it's through universities, research institutions and laboratories and the like. On the trade front, much could be done in the services space, certainly liberalising trade in services, which would increase the ability for those with skills in this area, whether it is researchers or policymakers, venture capitalists, those with expertise in green technology, to actually move and sell their services amongst countries. And these barriers are things that are amenable to being reduced in areas such as the WTO or in free trade agreements. And a slightly, aside from the trade issue, another role from government policy here could be thinking through ways of having new flexible visas, which would be aimed specifically at facilitating collaboration amongst people with this type of green technology expertise. A second consequence from a United States carbon tax is going to be on the production of green technologies throughout the Asia-Pacific region. Certainly it's a case that green technologies can be expected to be manufactured globally. Firms will be sourcing inputs at lowest cost, and we will see, as we see already with manufacturing, disaggregated supply chains largely located across the Asia-Pacific region. And in fact, we already see this beginning to happen. The wind sector is already globally integrated, and reduction in the cost of photovoltaic cells in countries such as China, Malaysia and the Philippines has been one of the key reasons which has been driving down the cost of these products. In this world, one of the key challenges for the United States is going to be squaring the political focus on green technology as a driver of domestic jobs and manufacturing with the welfare gains which come from allowing low-cost manufacturing occurring in other countries. One of the ways of getting at this issue is to realise that if one looks at the broader value chain of a lot of these technologies, that advanced economies like the United States and certainly Australia probably are well placed to actually reap a lot of economic gains from the globalised production of them. partly because a lot of the high-skilled services jobs are actually going to be located downstream, close to the market actually demanding these technologies. So if one, for instance, looks at the wind energy sector, you already see that a lot of the high technology, well-paid services jobs are actually located in areas such as marketing, sales, finance, transportation, logistics, wind park operations and maintenance, and there's no reason that the United States would not stand to benefit significantly from this. It is also true that in order for this type of supply chain to evolve, a liberalised trading system is going to be important. It's going to sort of underpin the capacity for firms to actually locate production facilities based on comparative advantage and to produce the most cost-effective and efficient green technologies. And in some sense, governments already embrace this idea. We see that in the WTO, for instance, in the Doha round, liberalising trade in green goods and services has actually been part of the Doha agenda. Obviously, with the Doha agenda not going anywhere, this is not a fruitful forum for making progress at the moment. At the recent APEC meeting in Vladivostok, there was agreement among APEC economies on a list of what constituted 54 green goods and an agreement to reduce average tariff rates to 5% by 2015. So this is some progress, but more obviously needs to be done in this area. And in fact, if one looks at certainly applied tariff rates between developed countries, you see that they're actually already very low, at least when it comes to trading green goods and services. So the focus really also needs to be on so-called non-tariff barriers. So for instance, requiring manufacturers to meet different standards and certification requirements can create unnecessary costs. It can prohibit the ability to reap efficiencies from scale. Now, the WTO technical barriers on trade agreement already requires members to base their regulations on international standards where they exist. So more work in this space on developing international standards for green technologies would certainly underpin greater regulatory harmony amongst WTO members and would help reduce costs of developing green technologies globally. Subsidies for green technologies has also been an issue that has received a lot of attention both in the energy green technology space and also in the trade space. Now, there's an agreement in the WTO, the subsidies agreement, which prohibits subsidies, particularly those contingent on export and that require the use of local content. Now, local content requirements in particular, for those who've been paying attention to this debate, particularly as it's come up in the United States and elsewhere, have become particularly popular, partly because they've married up with the political focus on this area driving local jobs and manufacturing. But the problem with local content requirements, of course, is that they also affect trade. They increase the cost of producing technologies because they force firms to source locally instead of being able to source lowest cost inputs. Now, this has actually led to some significant WTO litigation over the last couple of years. We see that there's currently a Canadian measure which is being challenged both by China and the EU regarding local content requirements in their solar energy sector, and China's recently commenced a WTO case against the EU with respect to the use of local content requirements in their feed-in tariffs, also in the solar sector. So this is another area that clearly needs to be addressed. A further area which is relevant from a trade policy perspective is also where governments use purchasing power to support green technologies, but do it in ways which discriminates against goods and services from other countries. Now, there's a government procurement agreement in the WTO which essentially prohibits this, but certainly in the Asia-Pacific region at least, besides the United States, only Korea, Taiwan and Singapore are actually signatories to this agreement. China's in the process of acceding to it, but there's still a way to go on that front. Other countries in the Asia-Pacific region do, though, have government procurement commitments through their FTAs. Australia, obviously, through its FTA with the United States, Korea as well, with its FTA with the United States, and we can expect some similar and significant government procurement rules in the TPP when that gets finalised. So certainly accession by governments to the government procurement agreement and progress on these rules in FTAs would also support globalisation of green technology at lowest cost. The third and final area I want to talk briefly about in terms of the impact of a carbon tax on trade is this so-called competitiveness and carbon leakage issue. So essentially we know that if the United States or if any country really prices carbon, you raise these concerns. Carbon leakage is basically arising when the carbon price causes domestic businesses to relocate to countries not pricing carbon or where the carbon price is less significant, to substitute for imports, imports which become cheaper coming from those countries also not pricing carbon, leading to essentially no net reduction in global CO2 emissions. And the competitiveness issue is a related one and arises when essentially domestic firms are competitively harmed because of cheaper imports from countries, again, not pricing carbon. Now, one response to these competitiveness and carbon leakage concerns is the application, essentially, of the carbon price to the border to imports. And the reason I focus on this tool is because it was a real policy response which was considered in the United States when work was being done in Congress to institute a cap and trade system in 2009. And if you actually, Claude Barfoot mentioned it briefly, but if you look at the EU Aviation Directive, the application there of essentially their carbon price to EU and non-EU airlines was specifically driven by carbon leakage and competitiveness concerns. So, yeah, it's a real possibility that in the event that the United States did price carbon, that application of the carbon price to imports would be one response that the United States would take to address these competitiveness and carbon leakage concerns. Now, finishing here. Yeah, now there are significant challenges with doing this in a way which would be WTO consistent. And the problem, of course, is that a WTO case takes approximately 3 years to run, during which time we might see tit-for-tat retaliation. So really this points to the need for a cooperative outcome in terms of how we manage this. Now there's a couple of ways of thinking about this. One is clearly to have a global carbon price which is not feasible in the short term or the near term, and another is to get a outcome in the UN climate change negotiations. We certainly know from Durban that implementation of agreement would be in 2020 at the earliest. And another is actually to address these issues bilaterally through possibly free trade agreements, which is another avenue. So I'll conclude now and just quickly say that in the Asia-Pacific region, I think the interface between how countries tackle climate change and how they manage the trade implications are probably going to be the testing ground for this globally. You have a combination of the world's largest developed and developing countries, so I think getting it right here is crucial. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Joshua. It was very interesting, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions and comments afterwards. Our next speaker is Mr. Peter Gallagher, who also has a varied and wide career. His paper is Technology, Intellectual Property, and Competitiveness in the Asia-Pacific. He approaches this with a background as founder and principal consultant at Inquit, where he advised businesses on trade and a whole range of other matters. He's been CEO of the Australian Dairy Industry Council. He's been on the faculty of the business school at the University of Melbourne, and prior to that had a 20-year career with DFAT and served in Washington, Geneva, and Brussels, involved in trade negotiations in a range of areas. So, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Joanna. Well, I'm going to see if the technology works before I start talking about it. I have to start with an apology, really, for... Are we live, do you think? Can we be live? Oh, come on, please work. Let's try it again. Hooray. Okay. Well, I have to start with an apology for writing a 40-page paper. If you think that a paper about that length means the author hasn't decided what it's about and doesn't have an answer yet, you're probably right. It's sort of embarrassing, but I console myself with the idea that you won't be much inconvenienced because you probably won't read it. Fair enough. But now I have another problem. And that is that Joanna has given me only 10 minutes to tell you what I failed to say in a 40-page paper. Well, 20 minutes, she says. Okay, so here are the questions I was asked to address. They look like they're about the future, about competitiveness in 2030, but they're not really. They're really questions about today and the implications of owning up to what is really in front of us, I mean in front of the United States and Australia right now. As for the future, well, up close the future is pretty much a random number. My guess is no better than yours about the firms and strategies. I've got a little story in my paper about the Apple share price in September 1992 that sort of demonstrates this point. But if we stand back a bit, it's not hard to see the overall shape of the next 20 years. There are some things like the roots of economic growth in capital and labour market deepening, and about the technology drivers of productivity that must still be true in the future as they are today, and if they're not, then you can stop worrying about the future right now and worry that we've somehow got the present all wrong, not to mention the past 200 years of classical economics. If you think that the sun won't shine in 20 years' time, then you have to explain how we got today's understanding of the sun so terribly wrong. In fact, almost everything we know about what's happening today in the giant emerging economies on just those axes of capital growth, labour market deepening and technological catch-up strongly suggest that we're in the middle of an unprecedented period of global economic growth and prosperity, and the future is benign, or maybe better, maybe much better. I think the world economy is going to double in size over the next 20 years, more or less. I think that China will be about twice the size of the US economy in 2030 and will account for about 1/5 of all world output and outcome. Now, doubling means a 4% rate of economic growth global economic growth over the next 20 years, somewhat higher than the 2 to 3% of the past 3 decades, but about the same rate as the post-war period of economic growth. I know that that sounds a bit ambitious. After all, the IMF and the WTO have been busily revising down their growth rates and trade outlooks in the past couple of months. Pascal Lamy from the WTO was in Melbourne last week using words like subdued in scare quotes to describe the prospects for economic recovery. So I imagine that you're looking at this fairly sceptically and saying to yourself, I should take my own advice and explain what's wrong with today's picture if I want to say that the future is going to be so different. Well, there's one part of today's picture of the world that's horribly wrong, and in fact 2/3 of it is crap. And the other parts aren't wrong, but just not getting enough attention. For instance, there's the uncanny progress of industrialised country growth, despite turbulence and recession when seen in a decadal perspective. This deserves more attention, but I haven't got the time now. There's a lot more about that in my paper. Instead, I want to focus on something that's nearly news: the death of origin. The idea of the origin of goods is a core concept of 20th century trade policy. It's the third rail in every free trade agreement, and the central focus of the much-hyped innovations in the TPP. It's the basis of border taxes, but it's almost entirely wrong. The news is we've now got the data to prove it. The rules of origin intentionally dumb down trade data by treating all imports as final goods, whose origin is arbitrarily assigned to the place of last substantial transformation, ignoring any other available information. But it's been obvious since the days when the Romans traded Spanish tin with the Persians for Chinese silks that origin is really a much bigger story. It's closer to the truth to say that everything you use as a consumer, or I use, comes from almost everywhere, or made in the world, as the WTO wants to put it, and it's time we dropped the origin fiction. Maybe we will soon. Pascal Lamy earlier this week said that the first reports from the WTO-OECD collaboration on a new input-output database that should start to give us the official figures on a new way of looking at trade will be finally available in a couple of weeks from now. But some great work by researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research has shown us that almost 2/3 of merchandise trade in 2004 comprised intermediate products, goods whose origin is typically a geographical collage. Millions of products, including minerals, ores and food, that are melted, welded, processed and assembled into another product, here or there or somewhere else, and are either consumed in that market or re-exported to be consumed or incorporated elsewhere, including often enough back here where they started from. To different degrees in different economies, but to a very large extent in every economy, intermediate products make up most of the goods crossing the border. Because most goods in trade are not finished goods, they're in constant exchange through supply networks, crossing multiple borders on their way from design to processing and assembly, and reassembly, testing, packaging, and sales. The concept of a supply network is due ultimately to Michael Porter's 1985 paper about the internal organisation of production chains in the most competitive firms. The core of Porter's idea was that competitive firms develop closely guarded strategies that relentlessly drive down factor costs through better organisation of their production and through close coordination with suppliers and complementary industries, usually co-located with the firm. Each segment in the lower half of this directional diagram is a value-added processing step in which raw materials or component parts, intermediate goods in other words, pass from one production unit to the next, a set of supply operations. Translated to the international scale and generalising, supply networks describe a medium for the creation and exchange of value added between economies. This abstraction, in turn, combined with some serious data processing, allows us to remodel national accounts data and trade data in novel ways, revealing a rich load of information about the mundane miracles of global markets. This is the new picture that justifies a revision of the future, and I'd like to take a moment to describe it. In the paper, I borrow Richard Baldwin's term, unbundlings, for the impacts of the two 20th century waves of globalisation on trade and the location of production. It's a modest word for an astonishing phenomenon that first saw economies of industrial scale in the early 20th century suck production into great industrial agglomerates that served world markets from Manchester, the Ruhr Valley, Yokohama, the shores of Lake Erie, and even from Silicon Valley when it first took off in the 1980s. Then, suddenly, at the end of the century, digital communications trumped location as a low-cost medium of coordination within firms. The agglomerates were smashed. Production was atomised, sprayed out over 100 different economies to take advantage of lower labour costs, access to capital, access to technology and know-how, language skills and insight into customer preferences. That's how we end up with the origin of most products being smeared across the globe. In iconic products such as the iPhone, the lead firm, Apple, makes none of the hardware. Samsung is the nominal origin of about a quarter of the hardware by value, with hundreds, ultimately probably thousands of suppliers from the United States, Japan, Taiwan, Europe, and elsewhere accounting for the rest of the value added. The resulting cost savings explain why you can order direct from Schengen and within 3 days receive the most sophisticated piece of technology, consumer technology ever made, for the price of a couple of dinners at a Sydney restaurant. Now, this is not by any means a news story. Almost 50 years ago, Leonard Read's little fable, I, Pencil, described the power of markets invisibly and unconsciously to coordinate what turns out to be thousands of producers around the world to produce the components of a simple, everyday product. What is new is that the supply chains have become the dominant mode of production. That's what the trade and value added data tells us, and the supply chain theory tells us why. Because no firm producing a manufactured final product can now be a top competitor unless it takes advantage of outsourcing. Following Porter's dictum, competitive firms drive down the cost of production by outsourcing manufacturing, assembly, and probably both production and non-production services to markets where the factor costs are more competitive. China's or Mexico's competitiveness in manufacture or assembly is Apple's and Samsung's and Toyota's and Philips' competitiveness. Exploiting the comparative advantage of our trading partners means that we import their competitive advantage. We don't lose by that, nor do they. We both gain, and that is the main reason I'm confident that the usual conditions for growth in the 5 economies that by 2025 will account for half the world's population will work better than they have since the boom years of the mid-20th century. And I'll give you one more reason in a minute. But first, a but. There's always a but. Some commentators, including Richard Baldwin, who came up with the idea of unbundling as it happens, argue that this is all very well for merchandise trade, but it doesn't work for technology. Technology is different, they say. If you license your technology or bundle some of it up with the outsourced manufacturing stages, you are undermining your own competitive advantage, giving away the family silver. Baldwin and a second British trade economist, Simon Everett, back up their claim that technology trade is dangerous with an argument by analogy that has to do with cricket teams. In the interest of cross-cultural understanding, I'm not going to try and explain it. It's in my paper, but I think the data shows it to be just as weak as it sounds. The reason for their concern is illustrated by a cutesy little device called the smile curve. Outsourcing manufacture and assembly steps in the centre of the curve there in a supply chain to the low-wage, low-productivity economies necessarily reduces the value adding in those steps. This means that a much larger proportion of the value in the final product is now attributable to the design and post-production steps, the front and the back of the supply chain. True, that's how Apple ends up with the lion's share of the value in the iPhone, although it makes none of the parts. Baldwin and Everett and others point out that these corners of the smile are the location of key intangible assets and production such as brand and IP. Any losses there, they say, and the smile starts to sag. Well, okay, but what does the data show about technology? Here's where the fictions about the origin of goods can be used to tell a scary but completely cockeyed story about, the decline of the West or some such bunkum. Take the US high-tech manufacturing industries, for example. This data from the US National Science Foundation seems at first glance to show that Chinese technology, high technology exports, are climbing faster than US technology exports. The gap between the two in 2010 was about 60% of the gap in 1998. But the fiction that all of the traded goods are final products of the country of origin exaggerates China's apparent gains in this chart. It suggests that all of the high-tech Chinese high-tech exports is of Chinese origin. But that's just not so. The apparent story misrepresents the low average domestic value added in Chinese high-tech exports. The NBER paper from Koopman and others, to which I referred earlier, estimates that the foreign value added comprises 60% of the value of China's exports in the ISIC category electronic machinery, for example. They estimate that only 28% of the value of those exports is Chinese domestic value added. A lot of what looks like China's gains here are re-exports of US and European and Japanese value added, and to some extent, the effect of rising Chinese wages. In any case, high-tech manufacturing is not the place we should be looking for evidence of technology leadership. Knowledge-intensive services, production and non-production services, are a much bigger industry worldwide than knowledge-intensive manufacturing, according to this NSF data. The United States excels in this domain of value adding. Indeed, estimates of the regrettably still unattributed contribution of these intangible assets to the contribution of the United States are huge, equal to as much as 30% of 2007 output, according to some recent research. So, the summary of my 40-page paper, so far it's all good news. Globalization's second unbundling means firms in both industrialized and emerging economies not only can, but to be competitive, must exploit each other's comparative advantage in value adding at different points in the supply networks that underlie most contemporary trade. The standard classical theories of trade still hold true. All sides gain from this mutual exploitation in the standard way. Porter had a non-standard view about the competitive advantage of nations, which I show in an appendix to the paper is just wrong. better still, supply networks squeeze every last drop out of comparative advantage by allowing it to operate at the level of production tasks, not just at the aggregate level of industries or sectors. But along with these supercharged gains, the threats to the gains are also supercharged. Supply networks involve multiple border crossings and multiple, even multi-scalar regulatory systems. Government should make borders as transparent as possible, certainly zero duties and zero barriers to modes 1 and 2 services exchange. They should harmonise regulatory frameworks affecting trade facilitation in other words, and should remove entry barriers and reduce ongoing operational restrictions, particularly those related to professional accreditation and standards on Mode 3 services exchange. The Australian government should implement the list of regulatory reforms that the Productivity Commission has been proposing for a decade and that was summarised by the outgoing chairman Gary Banks in a recent speech. Critically, for Australia as an economy at the upper end of most of its most important export supply networks, where firms producing raw materials cannot take advantage of unbundling to import competitive factor supply, the Australian government must work urgently and with broad consensus support on reducing the regulated inflexibility in our labour market systems and the relatively poor achievements of an education system not short of funds, but short on incentive. Thank you.
I appreciate both authors being very, well within their time, so we can allow maximum time for questions and discussion. I'd like to open the floor now to comments, questions, and there's a gentleman right here. And again, state your name and your affiliation before you ask the question.
Okay, everyone knows me. I'm Jack Chitty from Scots College. Just going back to Mr. Gallagher, when you said 0% duties on trading, do you think that the Schengen Agreement implemented in the EU was an effective policy of that nature?
The Schengen Agreement, are you referring to that? As I understand it, the Schengen Agreement was an agreement to reduce barriers to cross-border movement of people rather than of goods or services. The single market was obviously an enormous benefit to Europe for some of these reasons. Just as great a benefit was the fact that Europe, well ahead of Australia and much more effectively than Australia, has a single competition policy. Unfortunately, they don't have a single market in services, and that, I think, is costing them quite a bit. And it's one of the reasons now, I think, why adjustment in countries, in the Mediterranean countries, particularly in places like Italy, is so slow, because they don't really have competition in services with other efficient European suppliers. If they did, I think their recovery would be quicker than it is now. But unfortunately, I think Schengen, Schengen's really just about immigration.
Yes, sir, in the back.
John Stone. Oh, thank you. I just wanted to address myself to Dr. Meltzer's paper. It seemed to me to be a paper in search of a problem, or to put it another way, to be about Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. You see, you were talking about green technologies and going back from that, possibly a carbon tax in the United States, without ever raising the question, what is the so-called science behind all these initiatives? Now, I don't want to get into a long discussion here about what the science is or is not, other than to say that just in passing, that in my opinion, the so-called IPCC operations and their propaganda has been the greatest scientific fraud perpetrated upon the world for, well, I think in history, world history. Be that as it may, that's just my opinion. Yeah. But I'd also point out that I think it's increasingly widespread opinion. All public opinion polls throughout the world, certainly in the United States, certainly in Australia, show that less and less people believe in this nonsense. It's been foisted upon them by governments for a long time, and they will not have a bar, as we're showing now here in Australia in relation to our own carbon tax, of attempts to exploit it by governments seeking more revenues.
Well, Dr. Meltzer, would you like to address this question of the underlying assumptions behind green technology?
No, thank you for your question. Actually, it makes me feel like I'm back in Washington, which is great. You know, if you look at actually the polling data that's coming out of Washington, out of the United States generally, in fact, what you do see is growing majorities that do realise that climate change is happening and consider it a significant problem. But you know, the challenge, which is that I think the governments haven't done a sufficiently good job at explaining what needs to be done and what the costs are going to be in order to address it. And so you see actually delinking in the polling data between concern about climate change and what actually people are prepared to accept in terms of costs in order to address it. And I think I haven't seen polling data in Australia recently, but certainly that's been the trend in the United States. As to the scientific issue, I'm not a scientist. I sort of am working on general consensus, majority science, that this is an issue.
I think there's no doubt, though, that some of the doubts do make it harder to bring about the political support for some of the suggestions that you're highlighting, which is a carbon tax or cap and trade. So I have a question here and then here. Sir, here in the... Oh, well, I'm sorry, you've got the microphone.
I'm sorry,
yes.
somebody gave me the microphone.
Yes.
Peter, I think you're exactly right about your Apple example about global trade is clearly a critical one, and you know the statistics that you had on the board, I think are always worth remembering, isn't it? The case that 2/3 of what China exports is in fact from components that were imported before, and second, 2/3 of Chinese exports are by multinational firms operating in China. I think the big political question is how do governments communicate this new world of trade to populations to get buy-in? As you know, the problem with Apple is that Apple doesn't employ anybody in the United States. Apple shareholders make out like bandits, so the critics would say, but they do so by exploiting global supply chains, so they're not employing people in the US. You'll remember that the New York Times had a whole thing on, boy, this is all the money that Apple's making for its shareholders, but it's not employing enough people. So how, as a political matter, can the debate be changed so that what is clearly going on in the world becomes the subject of political discussion rather than the stylized and false reality that you criticize? That is that country A makes things and exports to country B. How do we change the political dialogue?
In trade policy, Jeff, I despair of that because trade policy is always made looking backwards. Never made looking forward. You're always looking at what happened before. And we've been working with really a false view of the world that we're about to be able to correct because it's been hard to find the data to correct it. I think I have to disagree with you about whether Apple employs people in the United States. I didn't see the New York Times report, but Apple is building this huge building in Cupertino in California to house tens of thousands of people. It certainly employs a lot of people and a lot of very clever people. Certainly, it may be that Honhai Corporation employs more people in Shenzhen and Chengdu and other places actually building the phones than Apple does in Cupertino.
40,000 versus 1 million.
But the reason they have such a small share of the value added is that they're actually lower productivity employees. So Apple is, like many other places many other firms located in that sort of industry, is at the leading edge of employing people who do much more productive things and they require a different skill set. Now, what's the answer on jobs? The answer on jobs has got nothing to do with Apple, it's got nothing to do with GM, it's got nothing to do with, the agricultural industry, it's got to do with aggregate economic growth in the whole of the economy, as you know, and this is the way in which economies grow. We grow by evolving and expanding and following our competitive advantage or comparative advantage. One thing I can tell you is that if the US economy is going to continue to grow, as I believe it will, and accommodate the extraordinary growth in population that the US is going to continue to see over the next 30 years, then it really must focus on its strengths, and its strengths don't lie in building iPhones. Its strengths lie in designing them, making the software for them, and making sure that, you know, it's got a product that everyone thinks is fabulous, and well, I think it's fabulous too. I think that's where its strength will come from.
We have a gentleman back here. Let me just say, in my paper, I do point out that according to press reports, yes, Apple employs about 43,000 people in the United States. Its foreign affiliates overseas employ about 20,000, and then its contract employees through Foxconn and other contract manufacturers employ between 700,000 and possibly up to 1 million people by now. Certainly there is an employment base in the United States, but yes, a lot of that is, the contract is overseas. Yes, sir, here.
Yes, I'm Drew again. My apology. I'm from the Institute of Transport Logistics Studies, but in my other life, I also did some modeling on climate change, the cost of of climate change, and I'm very interested in the presentation by Dr. Joshua Meltzer. I thought it very important, and I explained why. Because you raised the issues of how we use carbon tax to drive innovation. Now we know that, sorry to be a little bit academic here, but carbon tax is designed to correct for a type of market failures, which is called environmental failures, due to the fact that emission is not priced. A lot of economies forget the fact that there are two market failures. In this case, one is in the environmental context, the other one is in the energy context, which Dr. Meltzer raised. How do we drive innovation in the energy market? To ensure that if you put a carbon tax on, fossil fuel technology, renewable energy going to replace it. And I find that interesting that in the American context, although they didn't have a carbon tax, but a lot of focus of research is in technologies, which is in the energy area. Whereas in Australia, a lot of focus is on the carbon tax, but not so much emphasis on the technology, which is the energy area. And I would like to say briefly like this. Dr. Meltzer mentioned about the market failures in research and development, which is quite important. We talk about the future. I would like to add to that by saying that traditionally, people who do the research in the energy area know that there's another type of market failures, especially the electricity sector, which is due to the fact that there is increasing return to scale in electricity generation. And then the problem is, if you have that kind of market failures, you cannot deal with that by simply put a carbon tax and then hope that it will correct for the market failures. I just briefly explain why. If you put a carbon tax on fossil fuel, and if you assume that perfectly competitive market in the energy sector, then renewable energy will come forward to replace the fossil fuel-based electricity. However, if you look at wind technology, the more wind field you build, the more you rely on less and less favorable locations. So the supply curve is not perfectly horizontal, but it will come to resource constraint. So all I'm saying is that if you focus on carbon tax without focusing on the energy area, what you do is you put a carbon tax on it, you hope that the fossil fuel would cut back on production, we would not be coming. All it does is that they use the market power to push the price up, while the renewable energy won't be forthcoming because they strive with the resource constraint, even if the price increase.
Well, would you like to respond to that or make a comment on that?
No, thank you for that. It's a lot of important information there. I think we essentially are agreeing in the sense that the policy prescription, essentially, which I have in my paper, is a combination of both a carbon tax and specific policies aimed at incentivising innovation, and including in the energy sector. A couple of additional things. If you look at some specific elements of the United States market, one of the things that makes the transition of a carbon price through to consumer prices sticky or a little bit difficult, certainly in a bunch of states, is that some states have got regulated electricity sectors, which makes the transitioning of that price at least significantly delayed. Now, to the extent that you do see it, though, you would imagine that that is going to nevertheless be beneficial for the renewable energy sector, obviously, because that's the point of actually the internalising of the carbon price. But I think another interesting development in the United States, which hasn't been talked about much here, is the development of shale gas and unconventional gas resources, because that's creating fundamental change in the whole energy paradigm in the United States, and people do talk about this as the bridging fuel as the energy sector transitions away from particularly coal-fired power stations, possibly to even lower carbon sources in the future. But even with that, and in the absence of a carbon price at the moment, it's clear that you're still going to need specific government policies aimed at making sure that this is actually a bridge to somewhere, a low carbon future, and ensuring that the life cycle, for instance, of gas is actually lower, and that actually it does lead to the transition to renewable energies, which is going to require the types of policies you talk about, which actually aim at making sure that these are there and available and commercially usable by the time that you actually need them.
Well, I think with that, we really, in order to remain on time, perhaps if people have questions, they can talk to the speakers afterwards. This is one of the frustrations, I think, of any conference of this nature, is there's so much we could talk about, and I think all of us wish we could have a lot more question and discussion for all of these. I want to thank both Dr. Meltzer and Mr. Gallagher for their presentations, and also for audience questions and comments. Lunch now is being served next door at 12:30, which it is now. Just go out the doors here and take an immediate left, and we're in the room right next door. And please join us. There will be some interesting discussions taking place over the lunch as well. Thank you very much.